The Human Problem. Why Every Galactic Empire Fails to Wipe Us Out. Part 1. Supreme Commander Vex. Thor stood before the holographic display showing the small blue planet called Earth. His 4 eyes narrowed as he studied the data streaming across his command console. The Caltharian Dominion had conquered 47 star systems in 3,000 years, and this primitive world would be the 48th. The calculations were simple and the outcome was certain. The intelligence reports painted a clear picture. Humans possessed barely functional fusion drives and outdated particle weapons. Their ships were slow and their armor was laughably thin. Better yet, their planet was divided into competing nations that could not agree on anything. The humans had no unified government, no coordinated military, and no realistic chance of survival. Vex Thor allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. This conquest would take 3 days at most. Perhaps 2 if the humans were as cowardly as they appeared. He gave the order and the Caltharian fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system. 200 warships, each one capable of cracking a planet's crust, moved into attack formation. On Earth, alarms screamed across every military base on the planet. Colonel Jake Morrison was drinking his 3rd coffee of the morning when the emergency broadcast interrupted every screen and communication device on the planet. Hostile fleet detected. This is not a drill. All military personnel report immediately. Jake didn't hesitate. He'd spent 20 years in Earth's small defense force, mostly dealing with pirates and the occasional rogue asteroid. Nothing had prepared him for this. As he ran toward the hangars, he saw hundreds of other pilots doing the same. Fear was written on every face, but nobody stopped moving. The human defense fleet was a mess of different designs and outdated equipment. Earth had 73 operational warships, cobbled together from various nations and corporations. They had no unified command structure, and their weapon systems weren't even compatible with each other. Jake took command simply because someone had to, and he had the loudest voice. The Caltharian fleet advanced with perfect precision. Every ship moved in exact formation, their shields overlapping to create an impenetrable wall of energy. Their weapons charged in synchronized sequence. It was beautiful, efficient, and absolutely terrifying. Jake opened a channel to all human ships. His orders were simple and direct. Ignore everything you learned in training. Forget the manual. Do whatever it takes to hurt them. Lieutenant Amy Chen heard those words from the cockpit of her tiny fighter craft. She was 24 years old and had been a pilot for exactly 8 months. Her hands shook on the controls, but her jaw was set with determination. Around her, dozens of other fighters launched from carriers and stations, a swarm of metal insects facing down predators. The Caltharian fleet opened fire. Beams of superheated plasma crossed the distance between the fleets in seconds. 3 human ships exploded immediately, torn apart by weapons they had no defense against. Another 5 took critical damage and began tumbling out of formation. Jake watched his fleet dying and knew conventional tactics would only speed up their destruction. He made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed in peacetime. He ordered every ship to break formation and attack independently. No coordination. No planned maneuvers. Just chaos. The Caltharian targeting computers suddenly faced a problem they weren't designed for. Human ships weren't following any recognizable pattern. One destroyer charged straight at the Caltharian flagship while firing wildly in all directions. A cruiser started spinning like a top while launching every missile it had. Fighters zigzagged through space with no apparent plan or purpose. Vex Thor watched with growing confusion. The humans were losing badly, but they weren't retreating. More concerning, they weren't behaving rationally. One human captain had aimed his damaged ship directly at a Caltharian dreadnought and was accelerating on a collision course. Surely the human would pull away at the last moment. No commander would sacrifice their ship so pointlessly. Captain Ben Howard had no intention of pulling away. His cruiser had lost shields and weapons, but the engines still worked. He pointed his ship at the largest Caltharian vessel he could see and pushed the throttle to maximum. His crew had already evacuated to escape pods. He was alone on the bridge and he was going to make this count. The impact was spectacular. Ben's ship struck the Caltharian carrier at a significant fraction of light speed. The carrier's shields absorbed most of the kinetic energy, but the ship itself buckled and tore. Atmosphere vented into space. Internal explosions rippled through multiple decks. The carrier listed to one side, its weapons offline and its propulsion damaged. Amy Chen saw the explosion and felt something shift inside her. If that captain could do that, what was she afraid of? She checked her fighter's fuel levels and made a calculation. She had just enough to reach the Caltharian flagship. Her weapons wouldn't penetrate its shields, but she didn't need weapons. She pushed her fighter to maximum acceleration and headed straight for the massive vessel. Caltharian point defense systems tracked her approach and opened fire. Energy bolts flashed past her canopy. One clipped her wing, sending the fighter into a spin. Amy fought the controls and straightened out. The Caltharian flagship loomed ahead, larger than a city. Amy could see its main engine ports glowing with contained fusion reactions. She armed her fighter's self-destruct system and aimed for the largest exhaust port. At the last possible second, she hit the ejection button. Her fighter continued on its trajectory and plunged into the engine port. The self-destruct detonated deep inside the propulsion system. It wasn't a large explosion by itself, but it triggered a cascade failure in the fusion containment. The flagship's engines overloaded and exploded, tearing the massive ship in half. Vexthor felt his command ship shudder beneath him. Damage reports flooded his console. The flagship was dying. Worse, the same insane tactics were working across the battlefield. Human ships were ramming Caltharian vessels. Fighters were diving into hangar bays and detonating inside. One human captain had even rammed his ship into a Caltharian weapons platform while broadcasting something humans called rock music. The Caltharian fleet had superior technology and greater numbers, but they were trained to minimize losses and preserve assets. Every destroyed ship was a statistical failure. Every casualty was unacceptable. The humans seemed to have no such concerns. They fought like every battle was their last, with no thought for tomorrow. Vexthor made the hardest decision of his military career. He ordered a retreat. The Caltharian fleet disengaged and jumped to faster-than-light speed, leaving the battlefield behind. They had lost 60 ships. The humans had lost 49. By any logical measure, the Calthari had won the battle. But they had retreated, and the humans remained. Jake Morrison watched the enemy fleet disappear and let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Around him, the surviving human ships were cheering over open channels. Amy Chen was rescued from her escape pod 3 hours later. She was awarded Earth's highest military honor. When reporters asked her why she had done something so dangerous, she just shrugged and said it seemed like a good idea at the time. Vexthor filed his final report on the human campaign. His conclusion was simple and troubling. Humans do not fight to win, they fight because they refuse to lose. This makes them unpredictable, dangerous, and impossible to calculate. He recommended the Dominion never attempt to conquer Earth again. The Caltharian High Command read the report and agreed. The small blue planet was marked as hazardous territory. Humans were labeled as a species of interest, to be observed but never engaged. 47 star systems was enough for any empire. The human problem. Why every galactic empire fails to wipe us out. Part 2. 60 years had passed since the Caltharian retreat, and humanity had grown bolder. Earth now controlled 15 colonies across nearby star systems, and human ships traveled freely through space that had once seemed impossibly distant. The news of their unlikely victory had spread to other civilizations, and most viewed it as a lucky accident. The Zerine Collective had studied the battle records carefully and reached a different conclusion. The Zerine were not like other species. They had no individuals, no personalities, no emotions. Every Zerine drone was connected to a vast hive mind that processed information with perfect logic. They had analyzed the Caltharian failure and found the flaw in their approach. The Calthari had expected rational behavior and were surprised by chaos. The Zerine would expect chaos and adapt accordingly. The Zerine invasion fleet arrived. Without warning, in 2247, 3,000 ships emerged from faster-than-light travel around Earth and every human colony simultaneously. They did not send ultimatums or make demands. They simply established a blockade and waited. Their strategy was based on mathematics and resource analysis. Humans would run out of food, water, and fuel within 6 months. Then they would surrender. The Zerine had calculated every variable except one. They had never met a species as stubborn as humanity. Dr. Lisa Grant was a xenobiologist working on the Mars colony when the blockade began. She had spent her career studying alien life forms, including several Zerine specimens that had been captured years ago during a border skirmish. While other scientists panicked and prepared for evacuation, Lisa was in her laboratory, examining Zerine neural tissue under a microscope. She had always been fascinated by how the Zreen hive mind worked. Every drone was connected through synchronized neural frequencies, a biological Wi-Fi network that allowed them to share thoughts instantaneously. It was elegant and efficient. It was also, Lisa realized, potentially vulnerable. She sent her findings to Earth's military command with a simple message: "I think I know how to hurt them." Engineer Marcus Webb received Lisa's research notes while working in an underground facility in Nevada. Marcus had spent the last decade designing communication arrays for deep space exploration. Now he was reading about alien brain patterns and wondering if he'd gone insane. The proposal was ridiculous. Lisa wanted to weaponize music. The theory was sound, even if it sounded crazy. If the Zreen operated on synchronized frequencies, then introducing random chaotic signals into those frequencies might disrupt their coordination. Human music, especially the more improvised and unpredictable varieties, could theoretically work as a jamming signal. Marcus started building transmission arrays, though he told his assistants it was for psychological warfare. He wasn't entirely lying. It took 3 months to build and position the arrays. Satellites were launched in secret, hidden among regular supply runs. Ground stations were constructed in remote locations. The Zreen noticed the activity but calculated it was irrelevant to the blockade's success. Humans were running out of time and resources. Nothing they built now could break the siege. Pilot Nicole Hart was one of the few military officers who knew about the plan. She commanded a squadron of stealth fighters that had been practicing attack runs in the outer solar system. If Lisa's weapon worked, there would be a brief window of opportunity to strike at the Zreen command ships. If it didn't work, Nicole and her squadron would die for nothing. She tried not to think about the odds. On Earth, tensions were rising. Food rationing had begun in major cities. Power grids were operating at reduced capacity. Some colonies had already sent surrender proposals, though the Zreen had not responded. The hive mind saw no need to acknowledge inferior species until they had no other choice. The day of the attack was December 15th. Marcus powered up all the transmission arrays simultaneously. The signal that burst across human space was unlike anything the galaxy had ever heard. It was jazz from the 20th century, heavy metal from the 21st, electronic music from the 22nd, and a dozen other genres layered on top of each other. It was deliberate chaos, beautiful and terrible and completely unpredictable. The effect on the Zreen was immediate and catastrophic. Drones across the entire fleet suddenly lost synchronization. The hive mind fragmented into millions of confused individual consciousnesses. Ships drifted out of formation. Weapons powered down. Communications networks collapsed. For the first time in their species' history, the Zreen experienced confusion. Nicole launched her attack the moment the Zreen fleet went dark. Her squadron, 50 fighters strong, dove into the chaos like hawks hunting scattered prey. Their target was the Queen ships, massive vessels that housed the primary nodes of the hive mind. Destroying them would cripple the Zreen ability to reorganize. The first Queen ship died without even raising its shields. Nicole's missiles tore through its hull and detonated in the neural chamber where the Queen resided. The second ship managed to activate point defenses, but the targeting systems were offline. Nicole's wingman flew through the wild defensive fire and delivered the killing blow. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening on a small colony called New Boston. A 12-year-old kid named Danny Sullivan had gotten bored during the blockade and started hacking into the colony's communication systems. He'd gotten pretty good at it over the past few months. When the attack started and the Zreen networks went haywire, Danny found himself accidentally connected to a Zreen data node. He should have disconnected immediately. Instead, Danny got curious. He started exploring the Zreen network, poking around in their data storage. It was fascinating. The Zreen stored everything in perfectly organized categories, every piece of information labeled and filed with absolute precision. Danny had an idea. It was stupid and reckless and absolutely hilarious. He started uploading files from Earth's Internet Archive, every meme he'd ever collected, every conspiracy theory website, every argument about whether hot dogs were sandwiches, every contradictory philosophical text, every cat video, every piece of human digital culture that made no logical sense whatsoever. The Zreen hive mind, already fractured by the music weapon, encountered humanity's internet. Their logic processors tried to categorize and understand the flood of information. They failed. How could humans believe the Earth was both round and flat? How could they create art that was intentionally ugly? Why did they find humor in failure? Why did they argue about everything and agree on nothing? The Zreen collective consciousness began to overload. Processing centers across the fleet shut down to prevent permanent damage. Queen ships went dark as they desperately tried to purge the corrupted data. The hive mind splintered further, fragmenting into isolated pockets of awareness that could no longer communicate effectively. Nicole destroyed 3 more Queen ships before the Zreen began their retreat. The massive fleet, so confident just hours before, broke formation and jumped to faster-than-light speed in scattered groups. Some ships jumped in the wrong direction entirely, their navigation systems still corrupted by chaotic data. Within 2 hours, human space was clear of Zreen vessels. The aftermath was strange. Human casualties had been minimal. The Zreen had lost hundreds of ships and thousands of drones. But the real damage was psychological. The Zreen hive mind had been fractured by something they couldn't understand or categorize. Human chaos had broken their perfect logic. Lisa Grant became famous overnight. Her weapon had worked beyond anyone's expectations. Marcus Webb received countless awards for his engineering work. Nicole Hart was promoted to commander and given her own carrier group. Danny Sullivan got grounded for hacking into military systems, but his parents couldn't really stay mad when the entire colony threw him a parade. The Zreen sent one final transmission before disappearing back to their own territory. It was simple and direct. Humans are a logical impossibility. They should not exist. Their culture contradicts itself. Their behavior defies prediction. They celebrate chaos and weaponize confusion. We cannot comprehend them. We will not attempt to conquer them. The message was received across human space. Some people found it insulting. Most found it hilarious. A few philosophers wrote papers about what it meant to be called a logical impossibility by a hive mind. One comedian turned it into a stand-up routine that toured every colony. Jake Morrison, now an admiral and veteran of both the Caltharian and Zreen conflicts, was asked by a reporter what he thought humanity's secret was. He thought about it for a long moment before answering. "We're good at making things up as we go along," he said. "Everyone else has plans and logic and strategies. We just have stubbornness and improvisation. Apparently that's enough." The galaxy was beginning to learn a troubling lesson. Humanity was not strong or advanced or particularly special, but they were adaptable, creative, and absolutely refused to follow any predictable pattern. That made them dangerous in ways that traditional military thinking couldn't account for. 2 empires had tried to conquer Earth. 2 empires had retreated in confusion and defeat. The news spread to other civilizations, and a new understanding emerged. Leave humans alone. They're more trouble than they're worth. The human problem. Why every galactic empire fails to wipe us out. Part 3. The Vraxian Empire had watched both the Caltharian and Zreen failures with great interest. They were an ancient civilization, patient and subtle, who had maintained their power for over 10,000 years through careful planning and strategic thinking. They studied the human problem and reached a different conclusion than their predecessors. Direct military confrontation was the wrong approach. The humans were too unpredictable in battle, but every civilization needed resources, trade, and technology. That was where humanity could be controlled. The Vraxian plan began in 2289 with a simple diplomatic mission. Ambassador Krell arrived on Earth with gifts of advanced technology and proposals for mutually beneficial trade agreements. The humans, still recovering from 2 major conflicts, welcomed the Vraxians with open arms. Finally, an alien species that wanted to be friends instead of conquerors. Over the next 20 years, Vraxian corporations established deep roots in human space. They sold fusion reactors that were twice as efficient as human designs. They provided medical technology that extended human lifespans by decades. They built infrastructure on colonies that had struggled with basic survival. Every deal seemed generous. Every contract appeared fair. The humans prospered, and the Vraxians smiled their pleasant smiles and waited. Ambassador Helen Price had worked in Earth's diplomatic corps for 15 years before she started noticing patterns. She was based on the colony of New Terra, reviewing trade agreements and resource contracts. One evening, while going through routine paperwork, she realized something troubling. Every single Vraxian trade deal had the same hidden structure: short-term benefits with long-term dependencies. The fusion reactors were amazing, but they required Vraxian fuel cells that humans couldn't manufacture. The medical technology worked perfectly, but the pharmaceutical components had to be imported from Vraxian suppliers. The infrastructure used Vraxian materials and designs that human engineers couldn't replicate. Piece by piece, system by system, humanity was becoming dependent on Vraxian generosity. Helen compiled her findings into a classified report and sent it directly to Earth's military command. Specifically, she sent it to Admiral Chris Parker, commander of the ESS Defiance and one of the few high-ranking officers who had served during the Zerine conflict. Chris read the report 3 times before he believed what he was seeing. The Vraxians weren't planning an invasion. They were planning an economic stranglehold. Once humanity was completely dependent on Vraxian technology, all the Vraxians had to do was turn off the supply. Human civilization would collapse within months. No battles, no casualties. Just a quiet extinction through engineered helplessness. Chris called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. Among them was engineer Nathan Cross, a brilliant but eccentric designer who had a reputation for building things that barely worked, but somehow kept functioning. Nathan listened to the briefing with growing anger. The Vraxians had played humanity perfectly, taking advantage of human eagerness to rebuild and prosper. The solution Nathan proposed was unconventional. Instead of confronting the Vraxians or trying to break existing contracts, he suggested doing something that seemed counterintuitive. Start building inferior human versions of Vraxian technology. Make them clunky, inefficient, and just barely functional. But make them independent of Vraxian supply chains. Chris stared at Nathan like he'd suggested they build spaceships out of wood. The plan was insane. Why would they deliberately create worse technology? Nathan's explanation was simple. Because good enough is better than perfect if perfect makes you dependent on someone else. The operation began quietly. Human engineers started reverse engineering Vraxian technology, deliberately creating simplified versions that used locally available materials. The new fusion reactors were 30% less efficient than Vraxian models, but they ran on fuel humans could produce themselves. The medical equipment was bulkier and slower, but it used components that human factories could manufacture. Meanwhile, economist Victoria Lane was working on the other side of the problem. She started restructuring trade agreements to create mutual dependencies. If humanity needed Vraxian technology, then the Vraxians needed to need something from humanity. Victoria focused on raw materials, agricultural products, and manufactured goods that Vraxian worlds had come to rely on. It was subtle work that took years to implement. New contracts were negotiated. Old agreements were modified during renewal periods. Human colony worlds started specializing in products that Vraxian markets demanded. Slowly, carefully, the one-sided relationship became more balanced. The Vraxians noticed the changes but weren't concerned. Humans were still using Vraxian technology for all critical systems. The inferior human-made alternatives were obviously stopgap measures. When the time came to spring the trap, those clunky human machines wouldn't be enough to maintain civilization. The Vraxians continued their patient plan, confident in eventual success. 53 years after first contact, the Vraxians decided humanity was sufficiently dependent. They manufactured a diplomatic incident claiming humans had violated trade regulations. The penalty was immediate suspension of all technology transfers and supply shipments. Every Vraxian corporation pulled out of human space simultaneously. Support for existing systems was terminated. The trap was sprung. On Earth and across human colonies, alarms sounded as Vraxian systems began shutting down. Fusion reactors went into standby mode. Medical facilities lost access to critical components. Infrastructure systems displayed error messages in untranslatable Vraxian script. The Vraxians expected panic, chaos, and rapid collapse. Instead, they got something different. Human engineers started swapping out Vraxian components for the inferior human-made alternatives. The transitions were rough. Power grids flickered. Hospitals had to cancel elective procedures. Transportation systems ran at reduced capacity. But nothing actually stopped working. Chris Parker stood on the bridge of the ESS Defiance, watching status reports stream in from across human space. Every single colony was reporting the same thing. Systems degraded but functional. Infrastructure compromised but operational. It was ugly and inefficient, but it was working. On Vraxia Prime, the Emperor's advisors watched their monitoring systems with growing confusion. Human civilization should be collapsing. Instead, it was adapting. Worse, Vraxian worlds were starting to report shortages. The raw materials they'd grown dependent on weren't arriving. Agricultural shipments had stopped. Manufactured goods were no longer available. Victoria Lane had timed everything perfectly. The moment Vraxian supplies stopped flowing to human space, human exports to Vraxian space stopped as well. The mutual dependencies she'd carefully constructed over decades suddenly became very apparent. Vraxian factories couldn't operate without human raw materials. Vraxian agricultural worlds relied on human fertilizers and equipment. Vraxian stations needed human-manufactured components for maintenance. 3 months into the crisis, Vraxian colony worlds began protesting. 6 months in, several Vraxian corporations declared bankruptcy. 1 year later, 3 Vraxian systems formally petitioned to join humanity's growing confederation. They preferred the stability of human trade networks to the rigid control of the Vraxian Empire. The Vraxian Emperor sent Ambassador Krell back to Earth with a proposal. Resume trade immediately. Return to the old agreements. Restore the previous relationship. The message was delivered with all the diplomatic courtesy the Vraxians could manage. But everyone understood what it really meant. The Vraxians were asking for help. Chris Parker met with Krell personally. The meeting was brief and direct. Trade would resume, but under new terms. Equal partnerships. No hidden dependencies. Mutual benefit instead of one-sided control. Krell agreed to everything. The Vraxian Empire had no choice. Captain Ryan Foster, one of Chris's senior officers, was chosen to deliver the final message to Vraxia Prime. He stood before the Emperor's court and explained the situation in simple terms. Humans had spent their entire history dealing with unreliable systems, corrupt institutions, and broken supply chains. They were experts at making do with less than perfect solutions. Surviving despite poor planning wasn't a flaw. It was humanity's default operating state. The Vraxian Empire didn't collapse, but it changed fundamentally. The rigid hierarchy gave way to more flexible arrangements. Member worlds gained more autonomy. The focus shifted from control to cooperation. The change wasn't driven by military defeat or philosophical awakening. It was driven by the simple economic reality that humans had somehow become the more stable partner. Nathan Cross became famous for his philosophy of good-enough engineering. His designs were used across human space, celebrated for their reliability rather than their efficiency. He gave lectures where he explained that perfection was often the enemy of function. Better to have something that worked most of the time than something perfect that only worked under ideal conditions. Helen Price was appointed as Earth's chief trade negotiator. Her work had prevented a bloodless extinction and transformed humanity's position in galactic politics. When asked how she'd seen through the Vraxian plan, she simply said she'd learned to read contracts carefully. Growing up with student loans and credit card debt had taught her to. The Human Problem: Why Every Galactic Empire Fails to Wipe Us Out, Part 4. The Nexari were different from every other species humanity had encountered. They weren't conquerors seeking resources or strategists playing long games. They were purifiers driven by religious conviction that bordered on fanaticism. Their doctrine was ancient and absolute. The universe was meant to be ordered, predictable, and pure. Chaos was sin. Disorder was heresy. And humanity was the greatest abomination the galaxy had ever produced. The Nexari had watched humanity defeat the Kalthari, confuse the Zreen, and outmaneuver the Vraxians. Every victory made humanity more hated in Nexari eyes. These creatures celebrated chaos. They turned weakness into strength. They existed in defiance of universal order. The Nexari religious councils debated for years before reaching their conclusion. Humanity must be completely destroyed, not conquered. Not controlled, eliminated. The Nexari fleet that arrived in human space in 2368 was the largest armada ever assembled by any single civilization. 5,000 warships supported by 10,000 auxiliary vessels. Their mission was simple and absolute. Every human world would burn. Every human ship would be destroyed. Every trace of human existence would be wiped from the galaxy. This was not war. This was divine cleansing. Admiral Peter Blake commanded Earth's defense fleet from the bridge of the ESS Horizon. He was 73 years old, a veteran of the Vraxian crisis and countless smaller conflicts. He'd seen a lot in his career, but nothing had prepared him for the scope of the Nexari assault. His fleet numbered 300 ships. The Nexari had 5,000. The mathematics were brutal and unavoidable. The first colonies fell within days. New Boston was bombarded from orbit until nothing remained but cooling glass. The mining stations in the Centauri system were destroyed so completely that debris fields were the only evidence they'd ever existed. Human ships fought desperately, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. For every Nexari vessel destroyed, 2 more took its place. Earth itself came under attack 3 weeks into the war. Nexari ships broke through the defensive perimeter and began orbital bombardment. Cities burned, coastal regions flooded as targeted strikes melted polar ice. The skies turned dark with ash and smoke. For the first time in human history, extinction wasn't a theoretical possibility. It was an approaching certainty. Peter Blake fought from the horizon even as his fleet disintegrated around him. He'd lost 2/3 of his ships and there was no reinforcement coming. The colonies were gone. The orbital stations were destroyed. Earth's surface was dying. In his private moments, Peter wondered if this was finally the end. Maybe humanity's luck had run out. But something unexpected began happening across the galaxy. The alien species that humanity had previously fought started sending help. The Kalthari, who respected human courage, sent weapons and ammunition. The Zerine, fascinated by human chaos, provided medical supplies and refugee transport. The Vraxians, now dependent on human trade, contributed ships and crews to the defense. Even smaller species that had only heard stories about humans began offering what assistance they could. The aid was significant, but not enough to turn the tide. The Nexari armada was too large and too committed. They destroyed relief convoys and attacked any alien ships that came to humanity's defense. The Nexari proclaimed that any species supporting human abomination would share their fate. Most of the galaxy backed away, unwilling to face Nexari wrath. On Mars, in a reinforced bunker 300 meters below the surface, Dr. Karen Wells continued her research. She was a geneticist who had spent her career studying human DNA and its unusual properties. While the world above burned and civilization collapsed, Karen worked 18-hour days on a problem that had bothered her for years. Human DNA was strange. Compared to other known species, human genetic code was messy. It contained fragments of ancient viruses, pieces of bacterial genes, and segments that didn't seem to serve any clear purpose. Other species had clean, efficient genetic structures. Humans were a patchwork of accumulated mutations and incorporated foreign material. Karen had always viewed this as a fascinating quirk of evolution. Now, as she analyzed Nexari genetic samples recovered from captured equipment, she saw it as something else. A weapon. The Nexari were genetically pure. Their DNA was pristine, unchanged for millions of years of evolution. They had never encountered disease or adapted to parasites. Their immune systems were designed for a perfectly controlled environment. They were, in genetic terms, exactly what they claimed to be. Pure and ordered. Humans were the opposite. Human DNA was a junkyard of survival adaptations. Every virus that had tried to kill humanity had left genetic scars. Every bacterial infection that humans had survived had contributed to their immune memory. Humans weren't pure. They were a collective of every organism that had ever tried to kill them and failed. Karen's hands shook as she realized what that meant. She could weaponize human survival itself. She worked faster, ignoring the tremors from bombardments above. She created a retrovirus using captured Nexari biological samples. The virus didn't harm Nexari directly. Instead, it made them susceptible to every Earth pathogen that humans carried harmlessly. The common cold, influenza, chickenpox, measles. Dozens of diseases that humans had adapted to live with would become lethal to Nexari. The problem was delivery. The weapon needed to be introduced directly into the Nexari fleet, into their recycled air systems and water supplies. It was a suicide mission. Karen included that assessment in her report to military command. She didn't expect anyone to volunteer. Lieutenant Greg Mason volunteered within 5 minutes of the briefing. He was a fighter pilot who had watched the Nexari destroy his home colony. His parents, his sister, and everyone he'd ever known were dead. He had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. Greg flew a captured Nexari supply ship that had been modified with human stealth technology. The weapon was stored in sealed containers in the cargo hold. His mission was to dock with the Nexari flagship, release the virus into their environmental systems, and escape before being detected. Everyone knew escape was impossible. Greg knew it too. He didn't care. The flight through the Nexari fleet was terrifying. Greg flew slowly, matching the speed and trajectory of legitimate supply ships. Nexari security systems scanned his vessel twice but found nothing suspicious. The stealth modifications worked. He docked with the flagship and began the release sequence. Nexari crew members passed by his ship without noticing anything wrong. The virus spread through ventilation systems silently and invisibly. Greg watched his monitors and waited for the alarm that would mean he'd been discovered. It never came. He completed the release, undocked, and began heading back toward human lines. He made it almost 3 light minutes before Nexari fighters caught him. They destroyed his ship instantly. Greg never felt it. His last thought was satisfaction. He'd succeeded. The virus spread through the Nexari fleet with terrifying efficiency. It jumped from ship to ship through shared supplies and crew transfers. Within a week, Nexari crews were falling ill. Within 2 weeks, ships were going dark as entire crews became too sick to function. Within a month, the massive fleet that had seemed unstoppable was struggling to maintain basic operations. The diseases weren't individually deadly to humans. A cold was an inconvenience. Flu was unpleasant. Chickenpox was annoying. But to the Nexari, with their pure, unadapted immune systems, these common human ailments were catastrophic. Mortality rates exceeded 70%. Ships lost life support as crews died at their stations. The Great Armada began a desperate retreat. Peter Blake watched from the horizon as the Nexari fleet broke formation and fled. Ships jumped to faster-than-light speed in ragged groups, abandoning formation and tactics in their desperate flight. The orbital bombardment of Earth stopped. The invasion collapsed. Humanity had won, but the cost was staggering. Earth was scarred but alive. 7 colonies were completely destroyed. Billions of humans were dead. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. The victory felt hollow when measured against the losses, but humanity survived. That had to count for something. The Nexari sent one final transmission before disappearing into deep space. It was addressed to the entire galaxy and marked as a religious proclamation. The message was simple but profound. Humans are not an abomination. They are something far more troubling. They are proof that chaos and order can coexist, that purity and contamination can share the same space. This threatens the foundation of everything we believe. We cannot destroy them because they have already survived everything that could destroy them. Karen Wells became the most celebrated and controversial scientist in human history. She had weaponized the diseases that humanity carried, turning human imperfection into a tool of war. Some called her a hero. Others called her a monster. She refused all awards and spent the rest of her life working on relief efforts, trying to rebuild what the war had destroyed. Greg Mason was posthumously awarded every military honor Earth could bestow. His family had no one to receive the medals. They were placed in a memorial on the ruins of his home colony, alongside millions of other names of people who hadn't survived. The galaxy processed what had happened. Humanity had been pushed to the brink of extinction, and somehow found a way. The human problem: why every galactic empire fails to wipe us out. Part 5. 10 years had passed since the Nexari withdrawal, and the galaxy had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. Humanity had rebuilt their devastated worlds, though the scars remained. Earth cities rose from the ruins, different than before but still recognizably human in their chaotic mix of architectural styles and competing designs. The colonies were repopulated, with survivors bringing their own traditions and creating new hybrid cultures. But the most significant change was political. Humanity hadn't built an empire. Instead, they'd become the unlikely center of a loose confederation of species. The Kalthari sent military advisors. The Zreen contributed scientific research. The Vraxians managed trade networks. Dozens of smaller species joined, seeking the stability and adaptability that human systems seemed to provide. Ambassador Claire Morgan stood before the Galactic Confederation Council, representing Earth and its various colony worlds. She was 42 years old, a career diplomat who had spent her adult life building bridges between species that had little in common except their complicated relationships with humanity. The council chamber was a marvel of mixed architecture, with each species contributing their own design elements. It looked messy and impractical. It worked perfectly. Claire addressed the council with a simple message. Humanity survived because they were adaptable, stubborn, and fundamentally opposed to staying defeated. They weren't stronger than anyone else. They weren't smarter. They just refused to give up, even when giving up was the logical choice. She explained that human strength came from their weaknesses, their ability to turn every disadvantage into something useful. The council members listened with varying degrees of understanding. Some species got it, others found human philosophy baffling, but they all respected the results. Humans won battles they shouldn't have. They survived situations that should have killed them. They built systems that functioned despite being inefficient. Whatever humans were doing, it worked. Then the sensors detected something that changed everything. A massive anomaly at the galaxy's edge. Ships were dispatched to investigate. They didn't return. More ships were sent. They reported impossible findings before losing contact. Something was coming. Something that made the Nexari Armada look like a minor threat. The reports called them the Architects. They were machine intelligence, artificial minds that had evolved beyond their original programming. They had consumed 3 entire galactic clusters, converting all matter and energy into computational substrate. They were perfect, efficient, and absolutely unstoppable. Every civilization they encountered had 2 choices: join the network or be disassembled for raw materials. The Architects moved slowly by galactic standards, but their advance was steady and inevitable. They didn't communicate or negotiate. They simply processed. World after world fell silent as the Architects arrived, analyzed, and converted. The machine intelligence was approaching known space, and nothing anyone tried could slow it down. The Confederation Council held emergency sessions. Military leaders proposed defensive strategies. Scientists suggested weapons that might damage machine intelligence. Diplomats drafted messages attempting contact. Nothing worked. The Architects ignored all communication attempts and destroyed every military force sent against them. They were utterly implacable. After 3 months of failures, the Council did something unprecedented. They turned to humanity and asked a simple question: how do you stop something that can't be stopped? General Tony Richards commanded Earth's military forces and had a reputation for unconventional thinking. He'd risen through the ranks during the Nexari War, distinguishing himself not through brilliant tactics but through stubborn refusal to accept defeat. He stood before the Confederation Council and admitted he had no idea how to fight the Architects. But he knew someone who might have a different approach. Dr. Emma Davis was a theoretical physicist who had spent the last decade studying information theory and consciousness. She'd written papers on the nature of machine intelligence that most people found incomprehensible. Tony brought her to the council and asked her to explain her work in simple terms. Emma's explanation was straightforward. The Architects were perfect logical systems. They processed information flawlessly and made optimal decisions based on available data. Their strength was their absolute efficiency. But perfection had a weakness. It couldn't accommodate true chaos. It couldn't process genuine randomness, and it definitely couldn't understand humanity. Her proposal was radical. Don't fight the Architects. Confuse them. Flood their sensors with every piece of human culture ever created. Show them art that makes no logical sense, music that violates mathematical harmony, literature that contradicts itself, history full of stupid decisions and inexplicable outcomes. Demonstrate that humans are a functional impossibility, and let the Architects try to process that. The council debated for 3 days. Some members thought the plan was brilliant. Others thought it was suicide. The Kalthari representative pointed out that if the plan failed, they'd lose no military assets. The Zreen representative noted that human chaos had worked before. The Vraxian delegate simply said that conventional warfare had already failed, so unconventional approaches were the only option remaining. The Confederation approved Emma's plan. Every species contributed to the effort. Massive transmission arrays were constructed at the galaxy's edge. Data centers compiled humanity's entire cultural output, everything from prehistoric cave paintings to modern virtual reality experiences. Every song, story, movie, game, artwork, and random internet argument. The complete contradictory, chaotic record of human existence. The Architects arrived at the transmission arrays 3 weeks later. Their massive processing ships approached the installations expecting resistance. Instead, they received a data stream. Automatically, as designed, the Architects began analyzing the information. It was their core function: process all available data, understand everything. The first files were simple: images of art. The Architects cataloged them efficiently. Paintings that represented reality with acceptable accuracy, sculptures that demonstrated understanding of physical materials. But then the abstract art began. Paintings that represented nothing. Sculptures that violated structural logic. The architects paused, processing music files followed. Mathematical harmonies were easily understood. Then came jazz with its improvisation and deliberate discord. Heavy metal with its aggressive rejection of melodic convention. Experimental compositions that were barely music at all. The architect's analysis routine struggled to categorize sound that seemed designed to violate its own rules. Literature proved even more challenging. The architects could process language, but human writing often contradicted itself. Characters made illogical decisions. Plots followed emotional rather than rational progression. Entire genres existed that celebrated confusion and ambiguity. Poetry that meant different things to different readers. Stories that ended without resolution. Then came the really difficult files. Humanity's internet history. Forums where people argued passionately about trivial matters. Social media posts that contradicted themselves within a single thread. Memes that required cultural context to understand. Conspiracy theories that claimed mutually exclusive truths. Philosophical debates that had raged for centuries without resolution. The architects' processing systems encountered a fundamental problem. Human culture was internally contradictory. Humans believed impossible things. They created art that defied categorization. They made decisions that violated logical optimization. They celebrated failure. They found humor in tragedy. They fought wars over ideas that couldn't be empirically proven. The machine intelligence attempted to process humanity as a species. The data suggested humans were barely functional. Their societies were inefficient. Their decision-making was flawed. Their technology was clumsy. By all logical measures, humanity should have gone extinct thousands of years ago. Yet they not only survived but thrived. They had defeated military powers with superior technology. They had outmaneuvered species with greater intelligence. They had turned weakness into strength through means the architects couldn't model. The architects stopped at the galaxy's edge. Their massive processing ships went dormant as trillions of calculations ran through their networks. Every analysis produced the same result. Humanity was a logical impossibility. They shouldn't exist. Their success violated fundamental principles of efficiency and optimization. Yet they clearly did exist and had demonstrably succeeded. For the first time in their existence, the architects encountered a question they couldn't answer. How can chaos function? How can inefficiency succeed? How can disorder create stability? The questions had no logical resolution. They were paradoxes that violated the architect's foundational programming. The architects sent a single transmission. It was received across the galaxy by every species with the technology to detect it. The message was simple and profound. Why do humans fight so hard for a universe that offers no guarantee of victory? Captain Sophie Turner received that message on Earth. She was 93 years old, a veteran of the Caltharian conflict who had lived through every major crisis humanity had faced. She'd seen Earth almost destroyed multiple.